I shared that the mystery of the Shemitah begins with the mystery of the Harbinger. And for those who are watching this and who don't know the mystery of the Harbinger, just in a nutshell, the mystery of the Harbinger is a 2,500-year-old mystery. Goes back to the last days of ancient Israel. Israel, a nation that had known God, turned from God. God warned them, and before their destruction, 9 harbingers appear in the land of Israel. And they are warning, they are signs of a nation in danger of judgment. Well, the nation of Israel, they ignored them, and they were destroyed in time. The eerie thing is the same harbingers, the same prophetic signs, have been reappearing to America. It begins with 9/11. The first harbinger, and I can only just give a quick mention of them without going into detail, is called the breach, and that concerns an attack that's made on the nation. Happened in ancient Israel in 732 BC, happened in America on 9/11, 2001. It happens years before the judgment. It's a warning, a wake-up call that the hedge of the nation's protection is lifted and a strike comes on the land. The second harbinger is the sign of the terrorist, that the attack that happened on Israel before its judgment was carried out by the fathers of terrorism, those who invented terrorism, literally by terrorists, an act of terrorism. Well, that takes place in America on September 11th. It's an act not just of an attack, but of terrorism. The third harbinger is that of the fallen bricks, that the sign of the attack in Israel in its last days is that of the picture of fallen bricks. It comes from Isaiah 9:10, when Isaiah records what the people said in response to the attack. They respond with defiance instead of coming back to God. They say the bricks are fallen. And the bricks that are fallen, it's a symbol of buildings falling. 9/11, the image of 9/11 is of buildings falling, collapsing, and the ruin heaps of the fallen bricks. The fourth harbinger in the book is called the tower, and that concerns the appearance of a tower in the place where the bricks fell, where the attack happened, where the destruction happened. Well, it happened in America, that on the ground zero, on the ground where the destruction took place, a tower began to rise. That tower is the fourth harbinger, which is a tower of defiance, and a tower that in the Bible is not a good thing. There's so much to share about that. There was even a scripture hidden in ground zero linked to this, but that is the sign of the tower. The fifth harbinger is called the Gazit stone. That is the stone that the people of Israel took to rebuild and to show their defiance that we're not going to be humbled. It says, Isaiah said the people said the bricks are fallen, but we will rebuild with these stones. Well, Gazit stone is a large rectangular block of stone they chiseled out of mountain rock, brought it down to the ground of destruction, began to rebuild. Well, that same harbinger was manifested in America after 9/11. The Gazit stone appears in America and appears at ground zero. The sixth harbinger is called the sign of the sycamore. This is where, and Isaiah says, the people said the sycamores have been struck down. Biblical sign, warning of national judgment and destruction. The sign of the sycamore, the striking down of the sycamore, manifests in America on September 11th at the corner of ground zero, the sign of the warning of national judgment. The seventh harbinger is called the Erez tree, and that concerns a tree that replaces the fallen sycamore. It's in Isaiah, and it's a sign of defiance that takes place. Well, the sign of the Erez tree appears in America about 2 years after 9/11, when a tree appears in the sky and literally comes down to ground zero in the place where the sycamore stood. I mean, it's eerie, and nobody is trying to do this or is putting it together, but it's happening. The eighth harbinger is the utterance, and that concerns that a leader actually pronounces judgment on the nation that's in danger of judgment. Well, that happened in ancient Israel. It happened in America when an American leader, on the anniversary of 9/11, he actually pronounces judgment on America. Linking his words are all linked to the harbingers. And the ninth harbinger is the prophecy that a word is spoken by an American leader before the events happen that also pronounces judgment on the nation, but it's spoken before these things take place. That happens on the day after 9/11, when an American leader, famous, very famous, representing the nation, gets up on Capitol Hill and he pronounces the ancient vow of judgment, pronounces judgment on America, and identifies America as a nation in defiance of God. And he does it without realizing what he's doing, and he speaks about the harbingers, and he speaks about the appearance without realizing what he's doing, and what he says comes true. Those are a quick mentioning of the 9 harbingers. Now, the book also has several mysteries. One is called the Buttonwood mystery, or the mystery of the uprooted. Another is the mystery of the 3 witnesses. That 3 witnesses appear, according to the Bible. 2 or 3 witnesses are needed to pronounce judgment. Well, there have been 3 witnesses that have appeared in America pronouncing judgment, and the 3rd witness is the President of the United States. There is something called the mystery ground, a mystery that concerns that when judgment comes, it returns to the same ground where the nation is dedicated to God. And there's an amazing mystery that has to do with 9/11 that goes back to ancient times, called the mystery ground. And there's much more, but that is, in a nutshell, some of the harbingers and mysteries from which the Shemitah arose.